Before we begin, let's be honest. I know you want to buy more books. Did you know that you can buy books and help this very podcast at the same time? It's true. I'm not lying. Go to the restlesspodcast.com and visit the book recommendations tab. You'll find there a recommended reading list from us on topics like Reformed theology, Christian living, ecclesiology, as well as a top 5 list from both Matt and I. And we're going to be adding more books as we're able to whenever we get a chance. If you follow the links on the page and buy the book from Amazon, we get a kickback from that purchase. So go ahead, treat yourself, listen to me. I'm a pastor. Go buy yourself a book with our links and support the show.
This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless, a postmortem on the young, restless, and reformed. I am your host, Matt Klein. I am joined by Pastor Michael, and tonight we are actually doing something very post-mortem-y. Pastor Michael, welcome back to Restless.
I'm here. I'm ready. I'm still technically on vacation, so this is like a special vacation episode for me. So you're catching me at maybe my, most relaxed, or I don't know if that's really true, but for sure I'm ready, right? I'm as ready as ever.
Well, Pastor Michael, I hate to do this to you, to take you from vacation and perhaps put you a little bit more on edge, because tonight we are going to discuss if there are going to be any new Calvinist pastors left.
They have been falling like flies over the years. Let's put it that way. It is wild just to think back in, if we go back to 2010, 2011, a time like that when, these names were huge. It was kind of, it was at that peak where things were about to, I can't remember the exact, timeline that we've kind of walked through, but it just seems like we were at this peak at one point where, you've got everyone's in business. You've got the Mark Driscolls, Matt Chandlers, whoever else,
J.D. Darren Patrick,
yep.
Joshua Harris, C.J. Mahaney,
right? Who's the sanctification guy, or lack thereof? What's Free Grace Chavidian?
Julian Chavidian.
Yeah. So like just all these guys, I feel like, and maybe that timeline, maybe saying those years isn't quite right, but there was this time right in there where it's like, man, they're all there, and now boom, 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 right? Like they're just going. Kevin DeYoung, please don't do that to us.
Yep. So the reason we are discussing this is because over the weekend at their Sunday service at the Village Church, Matt Chandler and the other lead pastor of the church, again, this isn't about this, but you guys use made up pastor terms. So announced that he would be stepping down due to a failure in character. Now, I want to just say we are not going to discuss in depth the character or lack thereof of Matt Chandler. And nor the other thing, Pastor Michael, I was thinking about in doing the show is everyone just being like, don't you just think you should just be praying for them and thinking about them in this hard time? And that's certainly not a wrong thing. But I've realized, like, dude, we kind of make a show. And so this isn't like the ecclesiastical, like, spiritual, involvement, right? And then two, like because we make a show, we want to make sure we're recognizing our limits to not speak beyond into things we actually shouldn't and don't know a lot about.
Right.
But
so maybe, can we just say, what exactly this, something has come out, and that's the thing, right? Like, we're not adjudicating this. We're not watching over Matt Chandler. We're not,
Nope.
we're not condemning him. We're not doing any of that. We just, like, what has been reported is that Matt Chandler had an unwise relationship with a woman on Instagram where he was just familiar his wife evidently knew about this from what has been reported and said, what he said at this, kind of public meeting. It was not sexual in nature, is what, was said. And it just, once it came to light and somebody kind of, spoke out to him about it, a friend of this woman he was friends with, I guess. And then the elders looked into it after he came to them, and evidently they think he should step down because of coarse joking and a familiarity that he had with this woman that just didn't seem wise. That's kind of what has come out and what has been said.
Yeah, again, I think there's some kind of overly emotionally close relationship, comments that shouldn't be made. I don't know if it's across genders or just in general, right? They haven't released that because, again, all we're going off is a Christianity Today article that was posted. And obviously today, if you have the internet, you can find the video of this live stream service, because every service now in America is live streamed. You can watch this exact explanation. He is not fired from being the pastor. That perhaps is the only other thing we should add. He is stepping down for disciplinary action and a time.
Yeah, kind of indefinitely, right? Like maybe he'll come back, maybe he won't, and probably we'll just see, right? So we will see what happens.
So what about this made me think about this is this idea of, man, are there going to be any new Calvinists left standing? Because it's becoming a smaller and smaller group as this happens. Now, Pastor Michael, there's one thing I want to notice, and then I want to, because I know you and your wife talked about this for a little bit, and so I want to hear a little bit about what you guys thought about this. But the first thing we should note about these failures is I do think there seems to be a pretty significant age gap divide in New Calvinists falling and New Calvinists not falling. John Piper and older seem to be doing actually pretty fine. Younger than Mark, we'll say if you're younger than Mark Dever, a lot of heartache, a lot of failure. I mean, and then we don't even need to get into people who seem to have compromised on issues that they shouldn't have.
Right.
But I don't know. I don't know if that's interesting. I don't know if there's anything to that. Again, we're going to talk about if there's something in New Calvinisms that's causing this. And that would be, for me, one reason to think that there might be, because that would mean all of the men and all the leaders who spent time in churches, spent time doing all these normal things before all of this existed, are handling things, have seemed to handle things much better over time.
I wonder if it's just kind of like even as you say it, I think, is part of it just a bias of kind of category where, I mean, the only guys that are left when they're older are the guys who haven't fallen, right? Just by very definition. And so is it that, the guys who were around them back in the day, well, they are gone. Also, what do you count, as falling? Is it a weird view of faith and it's a connection to your justification and your affections and how they justify you, which, some older have maybe walked into.
Yep, that's true.
So, anyway, but what I'm actually thinking while you're talking is trying to think through how many of these people that we named at the beginning of this episode were really young when they got started. And I thought right away of 1 Timothy 3 when we're given the qualifications for elders. And it says in verse 6, he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. And, I'm not saying that this is everything, but it keeps going. It says, moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. So in the case of many, I'm thinking of, you see this for sure with Joshua Harris. I mean, he was just like this, wonder kid that, is put into the spotlight really young. But even with Driscoll, with Chandler,
this is Driscoll's claim to fame. This is pretty much Chandler's claim to fame, right?
Yep.
Driscoll's like, hey, I was never a member of a church, so I thought it'd be a great idea to start one.
Yes. Well, and even Matt Chandler has publicly talked about his own, it's very much I was saved and then I got into ministry and now I have this giant church.
Right.
Like that's kind of the progression that we've gone on. And I'm not saying, that all those are the same case, right? Joshua Harris, right. Matt Chandler, Mark Driscoll, they're not in the same category. None of the three, right? They're not the same. I'm also not saying that this is necessarily what happened, that they were just too young. They were recent converts and they shouldn't have been put in positions so early. But I do think that is something to consider. I also think, by the way, this is maybe an aside that doesn't need to be here, but I've been thinking about this. Tell me what you think about this. But, when we think about being, young and a recent convert, I've thought about that in terms of understanding, generational and covenantal faithfulness, where, when you have somebody who has multiple generations of faith behind them, right? Yep. Solid families, solid godly people, raised in places where they already have the categories of a biblical worldview from the start, right? They have many of the virtues being ingrained in them from the start, from the get-go, from the point of their birth. Versus those who, for not their own fault, right? But we live in a world that is covenantal. And so it's not just about what you personally decide and choose, but also what has been chosen before and by those who are head over you. But those who grow up in places where, hey, they're converted, and maybe even converted at a young age, and they've been converted for a while, but they have just a massive amount of trauma or other issues stemming from a completely broken, completely unbelieving household, and maybe many generations of that. In that case, I think that this passage actually says something to that too. Not to say that somebody in that position could never be an elder. I don't think it says that at all. I think we probably could find examples in scripture of those who are pretty young in that sense. And yet I do think that this gives us some wisdom, some guidance, even in that area, at least as a secondary application. So all this is to say that thinking in terms of those who are put into positions of authority when they're really young. How old is Matt Chandler right now?
Good question.
40s?
Matt Chandler, born 1974. So he is now, I guess, 50. Just very late 40s. Yep.
Late 40s, just 50. I mean, he has been in a position of pretty significant influence, popularity, authority, responsibility for a very long time. But also came into that very quickly, while he was still pretty young.
Right.
And that actually, I think is, it's one of the things that I think is affecting how we see this.
Yeah.
And I think there's more too, but I'll stop there for now, and we can get into more of it after a bit.
Well, yeah, let me just say, I do think there is. So I think that there are a few things you brought up that are important. Let me just say, number one, I do think a lot of, and this is why we're having this conversation, because of a lot of the attempts to dump on all the new Calvinists as what's wrong with everything is really reductive, because Driscoll, Joshua Harris, Tulian Shavidjian, and Matt Chandler situations are very unalike in
So different.
circumstance. And
They're
obviously
we talk about them together simply because we have made this category of
right.
the young restless reform leaders that
Right.
we put them together, but they are not the same.
Right. And so I think that that is really one of the big things we're going to be talking about here. But I do think another thing you brought up, which is important, is this idea of not promoting a new convert, which I think is a thing that could connect a number of these stories. And I do think there is definitely something to this idea of the person's spiritual background. Again, this is the exact reverse from evangelicalism. The fact that you have come from a Christian home and these things are actually should be considered an asset, should be considered a kind of grace, a kind of way God has prepared you for ministry, instead of basically the opposite of that. That if you were radically saved 2 weeks ago, that is actually the sign we're ready to follow you, because probably there's a lot of excitement, a lot of energy. And because the example we actually have in Timothy is still a relatively young man who's receiving that letter. But what else do we learn about Timothy? The scriptures which you learned from your mother and grandmother.
Yeah.
There is Timothy has a seemingly deep relationship. And obviously, if we're talking 2 generations deep, this is Jewish, right? They're Jewish on this side. Obviously, we think his father was an unbelieving Greek man, but there is a depth there that Paul says. And again, because it's covenantal, it's not an automatic thing. It's not ex opera operato. It's these people were part of God's people. They participated. You were brought into that, and that this has been a thing bearing fruit. And so as you heard about this, I just want to hear a little bit about what you and your wife kind of talked about, thinking about Matt Chandler. Then we can do, I don't know, a few of the issues I think this raises. We won't spend too much time on any one because we don't really, we don't really know, but I think there are potential pitfalls it at least points out. And then we'll talk about if this is New Calvinism's fault or if this is some other explanation is better.
Yeah, so I was, at one point, this was first, I first saw this because it was shared in our patrons Telegram group. Shout out to our Patreon. You can go and find that. But, I looked at my phone at one point after not having looked at it for a while, and there were 50 messages on Telegram that I was like, oh, what in the world happened? It was just kind of like all of a sudden it just exploded. And so I looked, and this was at the top. Somebody shared that, this thing had happened with Matt Chandler. And at first I just assumed it was going to be just like every other, right? Oh man, it's a huge, huge thing. And we just don't know. Right. So I don't want to comment like, oh yeah, this is a nothing burger, or it's this huge deal. I don't know. But, comparatively to other, recent scandals at this point, I'm going to put that proviso. At this point, it seems mild, in the sense that it's not a Matt, this isn't a situation where he was caught by police, with prostitutes or something, like that has happened within the evangelical world.
Right.
That's not what happened. Okay. It's at least, not quite so extreme. But it did just, bring up conversation. And, we were talking about how we're going to do this episode and what we would talk about, because we don't want to talk so much about the specifics of the case or the specifics of Matt Chandler himself. But one of the things I said to my wife, and, we were just chatting about it, is that, I have trouble seeing how somebody in the kind of position that Matt Chandler's in, with so much notoriety and so much, so much recognition. He's a well-known person. I don't know. I don't remember what the number is, but I saw somewhere. I think it was in the article. It had either it showed his Instagram or they said it outright. But it talked about how many Instagram followers he has, and this evidently happened on Instagram. And it was a lot. I mean, it was over 100,000. It was like 180,000 or something like that. Don't quote me on that because I could be totally off on it. You could probably look it up pretty quick, actually. If you want to look that up and let me know how many followers Matt Chandler has. But it's a lot of people. And I just thought, one of the things I said to my wife is I can't imagine being somebody in that kind of position, right? A well-known guy with influence, very confident. He's a good-looking guy, and there's not a handful of people within that 180,000 that would be willing to be like shoot a DM and tempt him, right? Like I can't imagine being in that kind of a position.
It's 135,000.
135, yeah. So I said 180. I was wrong, but still, it's over 100,000,
right?
And like that's a lot of people. And it's actually, in some sense, it's an almost inhuman amount of people because you can't know that many people. You can't relate to that many people, but they can see what you're doing, follow you, and they can send a message directly to you.
Right. And
just one of the things, I talked about was just the unbelievable amount of temptation that somebody like that would be in. We've talked about this in the past, but this is one of the things that I think, also connects to why so many, particularly these younger guys, seem to fall into various things. It just like the technology that we have being really new. I mean, it is still new. We are still kind of at the beginning of, the advent of the internet and now smartphone technology and things like that. But the fact that I have a smartphone, I have a computer and a smartphone right next to me. And right now I could go anywhere on the internet, right? I could look at things that are just absolutely despicable. I could, go and get on any kind of social media and reach out to just an unbelievable amount of people. Like temptation is everywhere,
right?
In that sense, right? And when you're a person in a place of significant authority, influence, notoriety, the chances that those temptations are going to come to you, I think, grows when at least on social media and the internet. And so I told my wife, I was just like, it's hard for me to think of how somebody could be in that position and not fall. Like that's the grace to me. That's the amazing thing when that happens to me.
Yeah. No, I think you're getting at one of the big issues that I think that this calls on is this just calls on the relationship to the internet and how big of a huge temptation, huge issue it is. And I think that frames it perfectly. And yeah, I mean, man, it's hard to imagine how great a temptation there constantly would be.
And let's wait here. So, I mean, when we talk about this kind of stuff, we always think, in terms of sexual temptation. But here they said, let's just take it at face value. They said, hey, there was nothing overtly sexual about this. There was just this too close emotional relationship between this man and this woman who are not married and who are both married. And this closeness, even that, the fact that we have the internet, and it's not just you and the 100 people, 200 people most directly around you, whether it be in your church, whether it be, at your place of work, wherever, just the chances that you as a married person could find somebody that you have really great chemistry with, just a natural chemistry, right? Just natural relational, you just mesh really well together. That you could find that very easily with that amount of people. Right. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And that is not something that would have been normal when you have, hey, it's just the village pastor and there's just, the 500 people or whatever in town. It still might happen, but it's just not as likely, it seems to me.
Right.
Whereas this kind of thing, it just becomes so much more possible, at least to a certain extent, when you add in the internet.
So the other thing this brings up is we often say women need pastors too, but we also see here, especially in our current time, the difficulty of it, again, all of these things that could go wrong. And it actually reminds me of a memory. Maybe I've shared this on the show, of when I was first married. So I've been married more than like 10 years now. And when I was first married, I met this Christian woman on an internship, right? I got married young. I was 21. And this girl and we got along, right? She was stoked. I was planning on proposing to my wife, while I was at this internship, right? I was there saving money, right, to get an engagement ring for my wife, who I'm married to. And yeah, it was great. And so me and this woman and another guy, right? There were like four of us that we were just all good friends, right? And she and the guy who was my roommate came to our wedding, which was cool, right? Great that they came to our wedding. And I don't remember why, but I was texting her after I was married, and I was texting her about something going on. And she just texted me back like, hey, hey, it's good to hear from you, but you're married, so we're probably not going to text like this anymore. And just like was like and I'm sitting like on the couch next to my wife as I get this message. And I was like, I just looked at I talked to my wife and I was like, so I'm pretty sure I just was talking to a woman who is the kind of woman that a reasonably whatever guarded relationship, friendship would be possible, but because she has that kind of character, she's shutting it off right here.
Yeah. Hey, this is another
like,
thing my wife and I talked about too, is that, we talked about, okay, where's that line, right? Is there any place where, I could imagine having like some kind of friendship with a woman like that is not my wife, that is something like what we assume was going on. Again, we don't know what's going on in this situation. And I just couldn't, we were both just trying to like figure out, like, is there even like, what about like, there's if there's like a widow, nearby, and, you meet them and, they become like a mom to you or something. But even that, my wife and I were just like, but even there, like, I can't imagine a situation where there's someone that it's like, I know this person and I'm really close with this person, and my wife isn't really a part of it at all.
Right.
I just can't imagine that. I don't know how, like, what that would look like even at this point.
And I do think that is part of the solution to women needing pastors, right? Is Titus 2 women told to be brought in. I do think this is multiple elders, right? Like, there are lots of ways for there to be healthy relationships, healthy pastoral relationships. And I do think, actually, and this is not something that's gender specific, it's actually something they at least used to teach at RTS. And I know I was talking to the senior pastor at Michael's church when he went to Westminster. This was kind of what they used for him. In talking about relationships that arise from these kinds of pastoral situations like the one you're describing, I've just heard this general rule of like, hey, you should basically meet with someone about 5 times on a specific issue, because beyond that, this is an issue beyond your ability to help with. And this is a way you prevent any one relationship from just becoming unhealthy in any way, right? An unhealthy, overly dependent relationship, right? Again, all kinds of things. And this is just the one way pastors will often try and just have general rules that limit those things. And that's, again, not women specific. That is just how do I make sure my pastoral counsel doesn't veer into unhealthy realms in general, which I think is a thing that can happen, in all kinds of circumstances. And obviously, because of our overly sexualized culture, we think of that one, right? But there are actually there's plenty of room for these things to go wrong. And that one is interesting. So let me go to the third issue here that someone pointed out from our Patreon chat. And so I thought this was a really interesting idea. So the Acts 29, especially the New Calvinist, the kind of pulpit presence that these guys have is super familiar, right? It is the man on the street. It is the I'm just a guy up here. And that there is in general in these ministries. And again, there's something refreshing about it, but that it is very like, there is authenticity is what's valued. We're going to tear down any divide between pastors and members. Right. I'm just up here kind of bearing who I am and bringing the word to you in a very personal way and that this over familiarity actually may cause seeping out into the relationships they have in a way that is actually unhealthy. So, Pastor Michael, you are actually a pastor with people. What do you think about this? And I just at least thought this was a very interesting idea in regards to a potential kind of issue that could arise.
I'm really intrigued by it. I think that there is undoubtedly some element of truth. Even, just the very idea of tearing down barriers, right? Where, and maybe sometimes that's necessary, but we live in a time where, just removing any kind of barriers, any kind of, just kind of extreme egalitarian, we're all on the same level, we're all in the same place kind of mentality. And when that is followed through on, I do think that could lead to an over familiarity. Hey, we're all just close. We're all just friends. We're all, hey, can't we all just get along and hang out? And that may put you in some strange positions. It's thinking about this has been sobering. This is something that I've thought about even before I was an ordained minister, that, my wife and I would talk about all the time. One of the things I told my wife once is I think that, because one of the things that I do that I'm not sure, I know some people are able to do this, but in many conversations at this point, I think that there are times that I've done this more than others. That I think that I'm pretty willing to look at my sin and not just like, oh yeah, there's that pride and there's that selfishness and there's, whatever it might be, but look at it and really try to figure it out. And not in a sense to try to justify it, but because I want to know what it is that I'm mortifying. And one of the things I told my wife a long time ago was, I was like, I think that, if I was ever to fall into adultery, it would be basically because of, a kind of over familiarity. But what I put it at is it's it would probably start as just compassion, right? Or like a desire to, hey, I met this woman who's really broken. She's, come from a horrible situation. She's, whatever has happened to her and I want to help, right? I want to help. I want to be like a brother. I want to, take care of this person. But in desiring to do that, which may not be a bad desire at all, I do think that sometimes there can be unwise steps that are taken. I remember D.A. Carson, the way that he put this once in a lecture that I sat in on. I don't remember if his lecture is maybe like a chapel service. I don't remember for sure what it was, but he talked about how a pastor that he kind of came up under when he was in the ministry always used the line, "Stay behind the desk." And this was his line of, there's going to be times where you have women from the congregation who come and talk to you and they're crying, and you're going to want to go and lay a hand on their shoulder or give them a hug. And his line was, "Stay behind the desk." Right. And I don't know that I'm doing justice to everything he said, but D.A. Carson said something like, that saved me many times, because that, over familiarity of, hey, I'm just going to be that close, compassionate person. I'm going to come and give you a hug. I'm going to be really like, we're going to bond emotionally, and I'm going to show you what it's like to have like a healthy emotional relationship with a man. Well, all of a sudden, I mean, where does that lead you? That's really dangerous, and so I think it's really wise to have those boundaries of, hey, you're not overly familiar. Like, the place for the pulpit, for instance, is not maybe to just bare your soul to connect with people in that way.
Right.
The place of the pastor is not necessarily to be just another one of the people, right? Hey, we're all in this together. In a sense, yes, right? You don't want to go to the other extreme and just be so stoic and so hard that there's no love between you and the people. But you also, like a shepherd and his sheep have a very dear and close and wonderful relationship, but it is not one without its clear differences. It's clear boundaries and barriers. And then, alongside of that, then too, is having those boundaries and barriers of things like, you said this, hey, we're going to meet 5 times, right? We don't have to keep meeting on some kind of issue, or just elements of, when scripture speaks about the discipleship process in the church, it's not something where it's just the pastor and he's doing all of this discipleship individually with each person in the church. It's almost not that at all, right? There's elements of that, but what pastors and elders are to do is to equip the saints for ministry. And this is why you have older women taking younger women under their care, helping them to, be lovers of husbands and children, keepers of the home, etc. in Titus. This is why you have, these other elements of discipleship that are just, they're going to it's not going to look like I have to have an individual personal relationship with each person, right? I need to go out and spend time with each person on their own, right? No, you're going to be discipling households. You're going to be discipling, couples. You're going to be working with people in that context, bringing people into your home so that you and your spouse, or maybe, you and other elders, there are many ways that you can do that. But yeah, I think setting up healthy barriers sounds a little harsh. I don't know, but healthy boundaries is such an important and necessary thing, especially in an age when those things are just out of control, right? Where chaos is everywhere, relational chaos is everywhere. That's important. That's a way to love people.
And we will, I think, we'll see. I don't think we're going to do it tonight as our night gets late, but I think we will record a purely Presbyterian on this particular issue in ministry, because I actually think it is very interesting to think about how a lot of this preaching style actually is meant to communicate you have a personal relationship with me. I'm saying things to you like a personal relationship, and thinking about how those boundaries would work, how that even works in like the way you speak to people, I do think is a very interesting consideration as I think about things. And so we'll get to that another time. But let's talk about let's make the final turn here was as if this is New Calvinism's fault. Is this are all these falls? Is this all like, that's right, everyone who didn't like New Calvinism was right, whether it be JMAC or the Arminians and the SBC or the TR people? This was always bound to happen because New Calvinism was just that bad. And so let's start. We can point out a few of the things about New Calvinism that may have kind of set this kind of stuff up. We already touched on potentially the young leaders in it, and their explosive growth. And And then we'll talk about what I'll call alternative theories, things that actually aren't really unique to New Calvinism at all, or if they are, they actually would be a credit to it. So here's the first one, and this is one we have discussed at length, which is the polity of New Calvinism, where the pastor is in many ways given a CEO, and the elders, right? He is a CEO with a board, right? Even if that is kind of a thing that they are set up in a way that is going to be long term, put people in positions where if they're good intentioned, temptation can overtake them, or people can get to positions of possible abuse.
Yeah, I think so. Right. I was going to call this the guy theology or ecclesiology, where like you're the guy, right? And that's why you have to have multiple screens in different places, but it's just you instead of having other pastors that you train up or what have you. You are the guy. And like you said, we've talked about this a lot, but anytime you have a system that just builds itself around personality, particularly one personality, I think you are much more prone to this kind of fall. Although that, I don't know if that's necessarily true. In some ways you're more prone to it, but maybe part of that is just that we see it more easily too, because you're the guy. When it all comes down, that becomes very obvious.
Sorry, I was just checking on something quick, but keep going.
I finished. I kept going while you were gone.
Great.
So I mean, when it's all kind of centered around you and your personality, that's asking for trouble, both in two ways. I'll add to what I said while you were gone. On the one hand, for you, right, because it builds you up. It creates a situation where you can more easily be narcissistic about what's going on, and that can make it more. It can make it easier for you to justify. Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot on my plate. I really connect with this woman. I need to, reach out to her and just talk because it really helps me, or, I'm really, I am this important. And so, is it going to be that big of a deal? David fell into adultery. Why can't I? Right. Like there's just ways that if it's centered around you, that can become a problem for you individually, and you can start to justify sin. On the other hand, I also think it can be a problem in creating temptation where others see you in that position. And the reality is that a man in that kind of position of power, authority, I mean, he is very attractive to a lot of people, simply by nature of his position even. And so that's just going to at least lead to the potential. Maybe it won't always happen, but it's going to lead to the potential for those who might approach him, send him that DM that might be, seemingly innocent at first, but there's something behind it in the heart that there is this kind of desire for that person that is not right.
I know we're not going to be able to do this in the interesting way that a lot of critics of New Calvinism would be, that talking about, well, it's really complementarianism or a lot of these things that are at fault. I think one others, and then Pastor Michael, if you do think there's any potential theological thing going on that could lead to it, I think another one is all the ways that New Calvinism was, and we talked about this even when John Piper described the New Calvinism versus the old, where it was like, hey, we're kind of detaching ourselves from all these like things we don't consider essential trappings of the Reformed Church. And I think that this detaching from the Reformed tradition was detaching itself from a lot of the built-in boundaries, the built-in understanding of the role of the pastor, the built-in all the way, like these generational kind of guardrails that prevented certain kinds of ministry. And again, sometimes should be questioned as times change, right? That's fine. but that was like basically the ethos is like, we're not doing any of that as a positive. Well, if there's a lot of if there is inherited wisdom in any of those, and you've said we're done with all of that, then it is an opening to potential problems.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything, would you point out anything theological? Do you have anything that we would point out?
I can't think of anything specific that I
Well,
would point to that would, again, kind of lead to this sort of thing.
yeah, and
Maybe, the one thing we've talked a bit about, when we talked about the, Jesus wants the rose kind of sermon, where, it's almost this, you saw this a lot with Mark Driscoll too, where very often within the preaching, and again, I don't know if you'd say this is theological, but within this kind of typical way of speaking about yourself within sermons all the time, it very often you were talking about how stupid all these other guys are, but look at the way that I did this right thing, right? Oh, that dumb pastor who said, yeah, who would want this rose, and he hurt this woman, but not me, right? Like I'm the kind of man that would stand up for this poor woman and say Jesus wants the rose, like I'm the one that would stand in the place to, like, make it clear that I would defend her. Or Mark Driscoll would often do this where, he's, you stupid guys who are just horrible to your, wives and women, you should be more like me, right? Look at all these ways that I do things. Look at how me and my wife do this. And so in setting yourself up as the standard for manhood, for masculinity and what biblical masculinity look like, you are setting up a situation where people are supposed to desire you and desire relationship with you and be attracted to you. And they're supposed to want that in the men around them.
And I think that, and again, I think here's the reason it's okay if we don't have a theological thing a specifically theological thing, because ecclesiology matters. Ecclesiology is theological. The Bible does tell us how to do it. It's because the sin nature of humans is a good enough explanation to explain how sin bubbles up. Like sometimes there isn't a worldview, implication of these things. But so if those are potentially very new Calvinist things, let me propose a few that would be like, oh, let me give one more new Calvinist thing that actually paints new Calvinism in a better light. New Calvinist leaders, elders around them, or other leaders, in we think maybe in Matt Chandler's case, this kind of group of people is actually just more likely to admit it and try and hold their leaders to account, even though they probably don't have all these systems to do it. That then the broader, whatever you want to call it, evangelical, whatever the popular Protestant churches, these churches, the leaders are more likely to admit it, and they're more likely to attempt to hold them to account. And that's why we see it more. That's a potential, and it would be a positive for them. So here are a few things that would make it like, hey, totally not unique to New Calvinism. So the one is, especially regarding the internet, it's one you've alluded to already, Pastor Michael, that celebrities are much more likely than normal people to stumble into these kinds of failures. What do you think about this as a potential alternative explanation?
I think there's some truth to it, but I also want to side a little bit with Joshua Harris in his critique of Mike Cosper always bringing up the celebrity issue, and say, I think it's a little bit of a cop out to even just like talk about it as a celebrity issue. It's just an all of us issue right now. Right. I do think there's a sense in which, again, I mean, when you have a position of significant influence and notoriety, the chances that somebody in, 70 followers on Twitter or on Instagram is going to DM you and say, hey, I really hey, I really loved the sermon. I'd love to, just chat more.
Right.
Here's this little story. And then you kind of get into a conversation. Then, hey, well, why don't we just like meet sometime? Because this is really nice. And, the chances that happens in a small group versus 135,000 Instagram followers, that's just, I mean, the chances seem so much more, it just seems so much more likely to me that would happen in that sense. But also, I mean, the thing I keep thinking is, man, I mean, this is, everybody knows somebody that's done this kind of thing.
Right.
Like just their friends, of people in their church, people who they work with, who have just trashed their marriages or relationships because they started talking to somebody else, or they were working with somebody and they got involved in a relationship, even if it wasn't sexual, that was just, it was just emotionally strained. They're more connected to somebody they work with than they are to their spouse or what have you.
Right.
This is everywhere. It's just everywhere.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think we should have a lot of grace in that, like, this is a massive problem that's just all over the place. And
Yeah.
at the same time, recognize the danger in that for each of us.
Yeah. I think that, I do think there is a problem with just calling it the celebrity problem, is that it is just, again, if we don't think normal people have these things happen to them so often, it's actually not because people listening here don't know churches where this totally happened, or the church you're in had a pastor where this totally happened, or multiple churches around you. It's just that because of how celebrity works, the only ones we all can talk about all together are the ones where it was a celebrity,
Yes.
right?
Right.
But in fact, there are many of us have dozens of examples of local pastors and ministries where this happened. And so I agree with that. I also think you brought up the second one, which is, if this isn't a specifically new Calvinist problem, it's probably because the answer is it's just such a wide scale problem across all of the church. It's just all over. And so this isn't unique. It's just the particular whatever theological tribe we came out of where we can see it.
Yeah. And it's not just the church, right? I mean,
Right.
it's everywhere in the culture. If you want to like just look up the statistics of inappropriate relationships that go on in public schools, or things like that, between teachers and students, like it's ubiquitous across our
Right.
culture. Now that, like, the reason we talk about it in the church is because it is much more grievous when we who follow Christ, and who, especially those who as pastors represent Christ very publicly, that they fall into this. That is, in that sense, more egregious.
Yes.
But it is everywhere. I mean, this is a massive pit that we as a culture have dug for many generations at this point. And the chances of falling into it just seem like it's not inevitable. I don't want to sound like it's inevitable, but it is a very clear and present danger.
Right. I do think it is true, right, that pretty much every Western institution is riddled with this, and the church, actually probably on an actual per capita basis is a much quote unquote safer place, better place for these things. Here's the thing I think as we close, that when I was thinking about this and I go, wow, who I'm actually praying for, as I talked about that, this isn't this specific, very remote by internet pastor that, whatever, that I don't have much connection to. This is what it made me really think about is, I think one of the reasons this is such a huge bummer for those people listening to our show, right, who became reformed through these kinds of influences, probably like me, remember when Matt Chandler had cancer, remember the like gut busting sermons he was willing to preach through that time. Now, since that point, I have not listened to him really at all. But what is such a bummer when we see all of this happen is the popularization of Calvinism and Reformed writers and all of these things taking hold in all these places. We see that, and as again, Pastor Michael and I, coming from a pretty strong, pretty staunch confessional perspective, go, yeah, this isn't all there, but it is better, right? This is better. These are changes for the better. This isn't the historic Reformed faith. This isn't full-throated, but this is just genuinely better in so many ways. And all the ways we're watching it seem like it's pretty clearly not going to be able to hold on and take hold are sad, right? For that reason. And so this is what I thought of it, is if you're a listener today and you're still in what we would call basically New Calvinist church, you're in a Acts 29 church, you're in a church that is basically not denominational, but tries to sing the theologically better songs and preach Reformed sermons and these kinds of things. Man, I care about your church and praying for your church, because I don't want your church or my church, not that the Reformed church not that Reformed churches are shielded from these things, but I just think, man, I don't want Reformed theology to lose its hold.
Yeah.
So that's my very un-TR take, right? I know the TR person would say, nah, we should want no one to care about any of these things again, so we can go back to, doing them ourselves uninterrupted together.
And total obscurity within the evangelical world.
Right. Exactly.
No, I honestly, that when every time this kind of thing happens, and this is, again, it's, I was talking about it with my wife, because we talk about this, often when these sorts of things happen, but pray for your pastors, right? And for you, right? I mean, pray that God would give each of us a deep and true love for him and love for others that is proper and within its bounds, that we would have relationships that are proper, as Paul speaks about the household of God in 1 Timothy and says, being a younger man, you should see older men as fathers and older women as mothers and younger women as sisters, in all purity. And that we would have these deep and real and true relationships together as the household of God, as brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, but that they would not be tainted with the various ways that our sins can taint those relationships. But pray for your pastors, pray for those men in these positions of significant influence and authority. It's never a good thing when this happens. It's never a time to rejoice because, Matt Chandler did all those woke sermons or whatever. This is it's a devastating thing. And if you're in a position of leadership and authority, even if it's just in your household, right? Thinking about, as you relate to your wife and your children, pray that God would help you, because there is significant temptation all around. There's significant possibilities to sin. I mean, the world, the flesh, and the devil are just as active as ever. And yet I do want to encourage everyone too, that the Holy Spirit is also at work. The Holy Spirit is, we'll see what happens in this particular situation, but even when a pastor falls, this is not something that God is thrown off by. And he even uses that to continue his work in mysterious ways sometimes that we can't see, but we can trust him even in the midst of this kind of fall. So pray for your pastors.
And this is why, for all of us, our Lord, when he taught us to pray, gave us this petition: deliver us from temptation. Well, Pastor Michael, we went back to true post-morteming this week. It was pretty heavy.
Yeah, it is. But it's important to talk about, right? It is something that is necessary for us to talk about, I think. And hopefully you talk about it here, but also talk about it in your families. Talk about it with your pastor, with people in your church, your elders. And hopefully this is just a help in doing that.
That's right. And if you want the lighter fare, you can go find our Patreon, where this week we released a yay, nay, or nuance about communion wine. And you can stay tuned if you don't want to become a Patreon for some more podcasts coming to this feed, which will be certainly of a different brand coming later. So we'll leave you in a little suspense there. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will catch you next week.